I never expected my life to unravel in a single week, but that's exactly what happened when I stepped off the train back into Redbury. The eerie fog clung to the streets like a veil, and my fiancée, Selena, was waiting for me near the old station clock. Her eyes were distant, rimmed with sleepless shadows, and a sinking feeling hit me before she even spoke a word. We were supposed to be planning our upcoming wedding, booking venues, choosing invitations, but I could tell she was dragging some invisible weight behind her. She offered a half-hearted smile, and I forced myself to return it. Deep down, I sensed something was horribly off. Only days earlier, she'd sent cryptic text messages that veered from apologetic confessions to anxious questions about my schedule. At first, I dismissed it as simple stress. Planning a wedding can do that, or so I'd been told. But as the silence between us stretched, I knew there had to be more. We grabbed a taxi and she quietly directed the driver to our favorite cafe. I tried to lighten the mood with idle chatter about the ride back, but Selena barely responded. Her fingers twisted around the hem of her jacket, white-knuckled and shaking. The car radio hummed with some old rock tune, but the tension in the air drowned it out. My heart pounded like a drum, each beat echoing with unspoken questions. Was she sick? Did someone in her family fall ill? A million scenarios flashed through my mind, none of them good. The moment we slid into a booth, Selena clasped my hand. Her grip felt cold despite the warmth of the cafe. She couldn't meet my eyes, so she stared at the chipped Formica tabletop instead. Finally, words spilled out of her in a trembling rush. She admitted that she'd been seeing someone else. Just once, she insisted. It was with a coworker named Kai, and she swore it was a mistake. My ears rang so loud I barely heard the rest of her explanation. I froze, numb, my thoughts scattered in every direction. Kai? The same colleague she sometimes mentioned in passing, the one who'd apparently transferred from a distant branch office just a month ago. She'd always described him as friendly, maybe too friendly, and now I understood what she really meant. My stomach churned with a tidal wave of betrayal, confusion, and heartbreak. The steam from my untouched coffee curled into the air, mocking my attempts at composure. Selena trembled as she spoke. She looked so fragile in that moment, like a shattered piece of porcelain. She claimed it wasn't about love, or even genuine desire. It had been a moment of weakness during a late-night project. They'd been alone in the office, fueled by caffeine and exhaustion. According to her, he approached her with a soft charm she hadn't expected, and the rest blurred into an impulsive lapse of judgment. Now she couldn't live with the guilt. Every fiber of me wanted to scream or walk away, but a strange sympathy held me in place. She was begging for forgiveness, tears streaming down her cheeks. My mind reeled. Selena was never one to keep secrets. For her to betray me, something deeper had to be at play. So I forced myself to stay calm, to listen, even as hot anger tried to claw its way out of my chest. What shook me the most was her plea that I mete out some sort of punishment. She was convinced she deserved something harsh before she could feel even remotely worthy of love again. The raw desperation in her voice unsettled me, making me question everything I thought I knew about her. Our wedding was just a few months away, and yet here I was, grappling with the biggest betrayal I'd ever faced. I couldn't eat. I couldn't drink. The cafe seemed to shrink around us, suffocating me with the bitter smell of roasted beans and regret. In that moment, my life felt like a puzzle with all the pieces scrambled. I squeezed her hand, but my mind was already racing with questions. How did we get here? Could we ever repair the fragile bond we once shared? And what did she mean by wanting me to punish her? I spent that entire night pacing around our small apartment, my mind heavy with possibilities I couldn't fully grasp. On one hand, Selena was remorseful beyond words. She kept trying to reach out, but I couldn't bring myself to offer more. Then a curt response. Every time I saw her, memories of our happiest days together came flooding back, making this betrayal feel even more surreal. We used to spend long weekends binge-watching sitcoms, shouting trivia at the screen. And now, a third party was suddenly in the mix. Someone I'd never met but felt I loathed already. I tried to imagine what exactly happened in that empty office. Had she leaned in first or had Kai? Did it matter? The mental images wormed their way into my thoughts, refusing to let go. I wanted to ask her about every tiny detail, but something stopped me, fear of hearing the answers. My chest felt tight, as though I were trapped in a shrinking room, the walls inching closer by the second. By dawn, the exhaustion took its toll, and I sank into an uneasy doze. I dreamed about our wedding, except in that dream, the aisle stretched on forever, and Selena stood at the far end with tears in her eyes. A shadowy figure hovered beside her, and as I marched forward, My legs felt like lead, too heavy to move. I awoke drenched in sweat, my heart slamming against my ribs. Outside, the city was already stirring, neon signs flickering off as morning light bled into the sky. Selena approached me hesitantly, bearing coffee and a forced smile. The dark circles under her eyes told me she hadn't slept much either. She began to speak, her voice trembling with guilt and something else I couldn't pinpoint. Maybe shame or a deep-seated fear. "I know this doesn't make sense," she began, fiddling with the lid on her cup, "but I need you to punish me somehow." Her statement made me flinch. I wanted to scream that life isn't a game of retribution, that we can't just slap a penalty on infidelity and move on like nothing happened. Yet her request was bizarrely sincere. She said she couldn't stand the idea of moving forward without facing consequences. She'd convinced herself that my anger, my refusal to let her forget was the only path to redemption. A tidal wave of bitterness churned in my gut. "How could you possibly want me to punish you?" I spat out, the harshness of my own voice surprising me. She looked at me with tear-filled eyes, and her next words sent a shiver down my spine. "I want you to decide how I make amends," she insisted, her lip quivering. My immediate reaction was revulsion. I didn't want to see the woman I loved crawling through some twisted ritual of atonement. At the same time, I recognized that she was consumed by guilt, desperate for any gesture that might validate her remorse. A swirl of conflicting emotions bombarded me. I felt pity, anger, and a strange protective instinct all battling for dominance. In my chest, we spent the morning in tortured silence. She tried to tidy up the living room as if cleaning would wipe away the sin that hung over us. Occasionally, she'd cast cautious glances my way, hoping I'd have some clarity to offer. But clarity was the last thing I felt, so I holed up in the bedroom, flipping aimlessly through my phone, half-heartedly scrolling social media. Each time I saw a photo of a happily engaged couple, I felt a twinge of envy and a sting of betrayal. At midday, I made a decision. I told Selena we needed space to think, or else we'd drown in our own confusion. She nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face as if she hoped this was the punishment she'd been asking for. Gathering some clothes, I headed for a short stay at a nearby motel. My mind was on fire with questions. Did she really believe we could fix this through some forced penance, or was this the beginning of our inevitable downfall? I took a small, grimy room at the Sunshine Motel on the edge of Redbury, just far enough from home that I could think clearly. The floral wallpaper peeled in the corners, and the overhead light buzzed every time the air conditioner kicked on. It felt like a perfect reflection of my mental state. Worn out, a bit damaged, but still holding together. I threw my overnight bag onto the chair and collapsed onto the creaking bed, finally letting exhaustion pull me under. A restless sleep took me, filled with half-formed dreams of Selena's face contorted by guilt. In some foggy nightmare, I saw her reaching out to me, wearing her wedding gown stained with dark ink, while another figure, a faceless man, stood just behind her, grinning like a phantom. I startled awake at dawn, heart thumping like a drumbeat. The sun's first rays filtered through the thin curtains, illuminating dust motes swirling in the stale air. My phone chimed with a message. It was Selena, asking if I was all right. I stared at the text for a long moment before replying that I needed more time. She didn't argue, only sent a brief apology and let me be. With a sigh, I dressed, grabbed a coffee from the lobby's ancient machine, and stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk. The day felt eerily still, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for me to make a move. I spent the morning wandering aimlessly. My thoughts circled back to her strange plea. She wanted me to punish her. Part of me was repulsed by the notion, as if it were some twisted attempt to whitewash her betrayal. Yet another part of me understood the depth of her torment. She wasn't just looking for forgiveness, she was desperate for absolution, a clean break from her own guilt. But could I be the person to grant her that? Around noon, I found myself at a deserted park. The swing set squeaked in the light breeze. There was a grim beauty in its emptiness, like a stage set for a tragedy no one else was watching. I sat on a rusted bench, letting the quiet surroundings calm my racing mind. All my life I'd prided myself on handling challenges head-on, but this was different. Love and pain, regret and anger, they tangled in ways I'd never experienced. I was startled when my phone rang, the loud buzz ripping through the silence. To my surprise, it wasn't Selena calling, but my older sister Rena. She'd apparently heard through the family grapevine that something was off between me and Selena. Caught off guard, I hesitated, unsure of what to reveal. Eventually, though, I told her the basics, that Selena had been unfaithful, and now she felt so guilty she was practically begging me to dole out a sentence for her betrayal. Rena listened quietly, her breath crackling through the line. She was always the level-headed one, the person who kept a cool head when emotions ran high. "This might sound odd," she said carefully, "but maybe Selena's not just looking for you to punish her. Maybe she wants to ensure you still care. Enough to be angry. Guilt can be a strange motivator." I mulled over her words, trying to make sense of Selena's paradoxical behavior. Was she testing whether I was invested enough to mete out some consequence, or was she genuinely looking for a way to atone? My sister's insight planted a tiny seed of doubt in my mind, making me wonder if there was more to the story than just a single impulsive act. I realized I hadn't asked Selena any deeper questions because I'd been too caught up in my own sense of betrayal. As the afternoon sun slid west, I felt a grim resolve taking shape inside me. I decided to return home the following day to face Selena directly. I wouldn't promise immediate forgiveness, but I also wouldn't abandon her to drown in her remorse. Whether it was misguided or not, she had reached out, asking for my involvement. If our relationship was to survive, we couldn't hide from each other behind separate walls of regret and shame. I returned home the next afternoon, feeling as though I were stepping onto a battlefield. The doorknob turned under my hand, but everything inside felt tense, as if the apartment itself was holding its breath. Selena stood by the window, gazing at the street below. She didn't turn around at first, but I saw her reflection, brows furrowed. With a slow movement, she turned to face me. We locked eyes. My chest tightened with conflicting emotions: anger, longing, pity, and a flicker of love that refused to die. We held that silence for a moment, neither of us daring to speak. Finally, I exhaled. "We can't go on like this," I said. "We need to talk." She nodded, gaze dropping to the floor. Wordlessly, she led me to the couch. I braced myself for the conversation, half dreading the details. Selena began, voice trembling. "I don't know how to explain everything. I was tired, stressed, and Kai kept offering support. Part of me just cracked. I'm not asking for excuses." A wave of frustration rose in me. "I wish it were just that, but you want me to punish you. That's not how this should work." My voice sounded harsher than I intended. "I'm not here to dispense penalties like a judge. That's not a relationship." She recoiled, as though the mere mention of a judge made everything painfully official. In her eyes I saw raw dread, the fear that I might genuinely pass a sentence she couldn't endure. Yet at the same time, I sensed she was testing me, pleading for a show of strong emotion she hoped would prove I wasn't indifferent. It struck me that her remorse was tangled with an urgent need to feel connected, even if that connection came through anger. She flinched, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm terrified I've ruined everything, that I'll never earn back your trust. There's a voice in my head that says I deserve every kind of misery. But if I felt something tangible, maybe it would remind me never to cross that line again." Her words twisted my stomach. I felt torn between compassion and unease. Riena's perspective echoed in my mind. Selena wanted proof I cared enough to be angry. Maybe her push for punishment was a misguided plea to heal. I rose from the couch, pacing near the coffee table. "I don't have all the answers. I'm furious, hurt, and confused. But if you want to make this right, you need to show me. Punishing you fixes nothing. Actions do." Selena stood, tears in her eyes. "I want to show you I'm serious about rebuilding what we had. Tell me what you need. If you need time, I'll wait. If you want me to cut ties with Kai, I'll do." Don't surprise mixed with a grim resolve in me. "Of course I want you to end that. But that's just the start. I need honesty, no more secrets, no more half-truths. And I need to know this isn't a way for you to dodge the real damage." She nodded, clinging to a last shred of hope. "I understand. I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything." She paused, nervously wringing her hands. "I've already looked up a couple of clinics. They specialize in couples dealing with betrayal and trust issues. If you're willing, we can schedule an appointment together." That stunned me. Despite my resentment, I could see she was at least taking initiative. Still, doubt gnawed at me, reminding me that a single gesture wouldn't erase the past or dispel the hurt that lingered like a storm cloud overhead. Sinking back onto the couch, I sighed. Could therapy unravel the knots in my mind? Would it guide me to real forgiveness? I wasn't sure, but seeing her desperation gave me a spark of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end of us. "I won't promise anything except that I'll try," I said, meeting her eyes. "But if you dodge responsibility or push me towards something I hate, I'm out." "Got it?" Relief passed over her face. "Got it. We stayed in that fragile truce, uncertain of what lay ahead but unwilling to let our love crumble without a fight. I spent the next few days in a haze, forcing myself to function at work while replaying every memory of Selena in my head. When I finally agreed to attend our first therapy session, I had no idea what to expect. My heart pounded the entire drive, there, and Selena sat beside me in tense silence. The clinic's reception area smelled faintly of lavender and disinfectant, a bizarre mix that only heightened my nerves. Dr. Mayfield, our counselor, greeted us with a soothing voice. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes that seemed to peer straight into my jumbled emotions. After we settled into 2 chairs facing her, she asked us to explain why we were there. Selena looked at me, swallowing hard before recounting the story of her betrayal, right down to the ugly details. I kept my gaze fixed on the rug, noticing a small coffee stain near my foot. Only when she reached the part about wanting punishment did I glance up, my face flushing with residual anger. Dr. Mayfield listened without judgment, nodding occasionally. When Selena finished, she turned to me and asked how it felt to hear those words spoken aloud. A lump rose in my throat. It's like watching a horror movie in slow motion, I admitted, my voice wavering. You see the disaster coming, but you're powerless to stop it. Selena's eyes glistened, tears threatening to spill. Over the next hour, we dug into the roots of our relationship. Selena confessed that she'd always struggled with self-worth, especially after her parents' rocky marriage and subsequent divorce. Meanwhile, I realized I'd been holding on to unspoken fears that maybe I wasn't enough for her, that I'd fail as a husband just like my father had failed mine. The air felt heavy with unburdened secrets, yet oddly lighter at the same time, as if the truth had finally found a voice. When the session ended, Dr. Mayfield gave us an assignment. List 3 reasons you chose each other in the first place, and 3 things you're both willing to do to make amends. Simple on the surface, yet unbelievably tough in practice. We shuffled out of the office carrying the weight of unresolved emotions. Back at home, Selena and I sat on opposite ends of the couch, notebooks in hand. The silence was almost suffocating. After a while, she scribbled something and spoke first. I chose you because you always saw the best in me, even when I couldn't see it myself. Her voice cracked, and she looked down as if ashamed to make eye contact. My chest tightened. I hesitated, remembering the countless times I'd admired her resilience, her warmth, her ability to bring laughter into the most mundane tasks. I chose you, I replied carefully, because you turn every small moment into something special. Even grocery shopping felt like an adventure with you. I paused, swallowing hard, and because you make me believe in a future where we both grow better together. We continued sharing our lists, each revelation chipping away at the wall of resentment between us. By the time we'd finished, we were both in tears, some mix of grief and tentative hope. Tentatively, I reached out and took her hand. For the first time in days, she didn't flinch. Night crept in, draping the apartment in shadows. We talked about Kai, about how she would formally request a transfer away from his department. The very mention of his name sent spikes of jealousy, through me, but I forced myself to focus on solutions rather than anger. If we were ever going to rebuild, we needed to remove every trigger for this betrayal. Before bed, Selena asked, "Is this what you'd call a punishment?" The question hung in the air. "No," I finally said, my voice steady. "It's a commitment. We'll either fight for this relationship with everything we have, or we'll let it go. But we won't let it sink under some notion of payback. That's not love." She exhaled, relief mingling with sadness. "Then I'm ready to fight," she whispered. And for the first time in a week, I believed her. The days after our counseling session felt strangely peaceful, almost deceptive in their calm. Selena and I settled into a routine of transparent conversations. We'd talk about how we felt upon waking, what triggered our fears throughout the day, and how we could support one another without falling into old patterns. Little by little, I sensed the foundation of our relationship strengthening, though cracks still remained. Small echoes of doubt that neither of us could fully silence. One evening, while we were cooking dinner, Selena's phone buzzed with a message. She tensed immediately, glancing at the screen with wide eyes. My stomach clenched at the possibility it was Kai. For a moment, I almost snapped, ready to demand she block him, but then she turned the screen to me. The message was from her manager, not Kai, though it contained startling news. Kai hadn't shown up to work in days. I frowned, confused. "He just vanished?" I asked, stirring the tomato sauce absently. "Didn't he mention transferring to another branch or something?" Selena shook her head, worry etched on her face. "No. Everyone's baffled. He didn't give any notice. Just stopped coming." An unspoken apprehension settled in the air. Despite my lingering resentment, I couldn't deny an odd sense of dread. Had Kai, the source of all our turmoil, truly disappeared without a trace? That night, I dreamed of the day Selena confessed her affair. Except in the dream, it was reversed. I was the one standing there, consumed by guilt, while Selena listened, with an unreadable expression. A haunting chill clung to me when I woke up. We'd done so much work to heal, but the shadows of her betrayal still lurked. Or was it even a betrayal? A question nagged at me. Did I know the full story? The following afternoon, Selena got a call from a local detective named Erwin. He wanted to ask about Kai, who was now officially reported missing. My pulse quickened as I listened to her side of the conversation. She explained that she'd had minimal contact with him recently. Her voice trembled, though she tried to mask it. When she hung up, she looked shaken. He asked if Kai had any enemies or if he'd been acting strangely, she murmured, sinking onto the couch. A swirl of dread overtook me. Why would they ask you that? I blurted. Her shoulders sagged. Because people at the office knew we'd been close. The room fell into a thick silence. I slumped beside her, overwhelmed by the memory of the original confession, the heartbreak it triggered, and the uncertain path we'd walked since. A creeping suspicion began to take shape in my mind, though I couldn't yet name it. That night, Selena insisted we talk before bed. I braced myself for another wave of guilt-ridden admissions, but her eyes held a quiet resolve. I need to tell you something, she said softly. There's more to Kai than you realize. She inhaled shakily, then confessed that Kai had a reputation for manipulation. Rumor had it he'd blackmailed coworkers in the past, using personal information to control them. When he started showing interest in her, she sensed that same menace. He dropped comments about me, insinuating he knew secrets I'd never told her, and suggested that if she didn't comply, he'd make life miserable. Fearful and cornered, she devised a plan she now regretted. She staged the affair. For weeks, she'd pretended to flirt back, only going far enough to keep him from digging deeper into our lives. But when he began pushing her to break off our engagement and revealed he had ways of sabotaging my career, she panicked. In a frantic attempt to shield me, she fabricated a one-night stand and confessed to me first. She hoped my anger would keep him at bay while also alerting me that something was amiss. Only her plan spun out of control. She never expected me to leave, or for Kai to vanish. My heart hammered as her words sank in. Anger, shock, and relief crashed together. You mean you never actually slept with him? I asked, nearly choking on the question. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I was desperate to protect you. I went too far. I'm so sorry. For a moment I just stared at her, the world tilting on its axis. All our suffering, the therapy, the heartbreak, it was based on a lie told in the name of love. I reached out, my hand trembling. Why, didn't you trust me enough to tell me from the start? She wept softly, unable to answer. Suddenly, everything felt both broken and whole, our future suspended between betrayal and sacrifice. That's the end of today's story. Did things turn out the way you thought, or were there some surprises along the way? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you haven't joined the community yet, now's the perfect time. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're always the first to catch new stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next adventure.